I'm going to spare you guys the marketing slides. I'm sure nobody's going to be upset with me over that. So I'm just going to get right into the technology and get into showing a live product demo. So kind of, talking about what Datical is all about. And we're really about, addressing a problem which is coming up as people are wanting to adopt agile, release methodologies to deliver, more frequent tweaks to the application, more frequent features. And instead of doing it once every year or once every 6 months, now we're looking at monthly cadence, even weekly cadences. And so a lot of tools have been addressed on the development side to deal with that, around the build automation tools, around test automation, and deployment automation. And the database changes really, nothing's really changed there. And so same processes and tools that have been used for 25 years. Yeah, there's some tweaks to the tools, but the overall process and concepts are, managing the databases really has not, technically changed. And a lot of manual work has to be done, a lot of, tweaking environment knobs and stuff like that. So they're very, unique, unfortunately sometimes managed as snowflakes, where each database, even though it's supporting the same application, may be different from one environment to the next, and it just makes it very challenging to, automate that. And really what Datical brings to the table is really an automated approach to do this. And some of the things that we had to think about when we wanted to automate database changes was, since databases have state and have data, you can't just plop down, copy over a new version of the database like you do the application. So things have to be migrated, continual refinement. But how do you do that in automation? Because certain things you need to be able to catch. For example, my favorite is, a valid SQL could actually have bad results. So you could actually promote a valid SQL through automation that could choke a database out. For example, adding a column to a table with a default value. Perfectly legit thing to do to a database. However, if I do that in production with a table with tons of data, it could lock the table for hours depending on the database. And so how do we catch that stuff? And that's really what Datical really focused on when we started the company. And what we realized is we had to completely change and revolutionize how we approach database changes. Instead of doing it the same old way and just making it incrementally better, we needed to come up with a way that was kind of revolutionize the process, very similar to the way, Agile has revolutionized the old waterfall techniques from development. And the first thing we realized is working with raw SQL is really hard to do in this world. And so we chose to abstract the SQL at a higher level, at a model level. And the reason we do that is that for multiple fold. Number one, it's a lot easier to manage than version control, which is a very key component to, Agile methodologies. It's easier to branch and merge, and a lot easier than SQL, raw SQL. And more importantly is something that we have called forecast. What forecast will do is take changes that are coming, look at the target environment, and run a simulation of those changes to let you know if those changes would even work. So it gives you a way to validate changes to ensure that they would even work in the target environment. A reason why they might not work, now left picking on tables. If I'm adding a column to a table and I did this in development and I try to deploy that column add to test and I forgot to create the table in test first, column add is going to fail. Forecast captures that type of things and will let you know ahead of time that certain changes are not going to work in that environment. So you can run forecast outside of a release window. It's safe. It's not going to actually make the changes to the database, so you can run it during your business hours. And that'll cover what we call logical checks, as will things work or is it going to break things, or even if data is going to be potentially deleted or altered with an operation. We then realized that that's all well and good, but how do we catch things like good SQL that we just don't want to run in their environment? Or maybe there are certain operations we don't want to run in automation. Like some customers never want to do a drop table in production, for example, because they manage that a certain way so they ensure they don't lose data. So how do we control the stuff we don't want to do. That's where you can extend forecast beyond its logical checks out of the box to where forecast can be extended with your own custom business and technical rules. And the reason I say business and technical rules, because you can even have rules that say database changes need to be identified a certain way. They need to have, like a request for change number in there, which may reference an external system that you have, as well as maybe all changes have to have comments. And then there's technical rules that you can implement. For example, like the column add. Like if we see if a column add comes in, it's set in a default value, reject it or kick it back. Or if someone's trying to grant sysdba to an object and you don't support that, kick it back. And so you're able to refine that. And so basically the rules allow the DBA teams now to, instead of having to review every piece of SQL to make sure people aren't trying to do things that won't work or can cause havoc, they can automate the checks through the rules. And so now that will better support automation of changes without having the DBA team review every change, because that, number one, that can just drive the DBA team nuts, and you just can't, it's hard to scale. I mean, there's a lot of time lag with that, so how do we automate that with the rules? So the goal is to have the rule set up, forecastability, and push that stuff to the left of the pipeline. So I want whoever's developing the database changes, they're going to have to run rules on those changes in their local environments if they're checking in the build environment. So every step where Datical deploys database changes, these rules, you're going to forecast and run the rules each time to make sure that the changes will work in that target environment, as well as adhere to your corporate standards. So it gives you now a lot of testing and a lot of validation of the database changes as they move from environment to environment. So with that set up, then deployment really does become, literally a button push to say, hey, we're running deploy. We've gotten through all the gauntlet of rules. Let's go ahead and deploy the changes. And then from a management ability, just being able to know what's been deployed to what environment, like, how many changes is production behind versus stage versus QA, and so on. Just having that visibility to know, and also from an auditing standpoint, who deployed what, when, and where. And so now you have clarity and visibility to all of that. Last slide here, the way the product is organized and architected is we have the notion of what we call a deployment pipeline, which is really kind of where database changes start in your process and where's the final destination. So they may start in dev, they go through a test step and a production step, or it may be more than that depending on your environment. There's then the artifacts that are part of the Datical package. The first one is a change set. And a change set is basically the way we encapsulate a database change. No matter what that change is, we're going to encapsulate it in a change set, because then we can apply intelligence to that change set, which will help control the change to make sure it's ready to be released and it's going to go to the appropriate environment and tied to the appropriate release. Especially becomes important as you're moving database changes into the Agile world. People might be working on a May release, a June release, and a July release simultaneously. I need to make sure my database changes can easily line up with that methodology. So when it's time to deploy those respective releases, we know exactly which database changes go with those releases as well. So the change sets and the intelligence behind the change sets help us organize that. And then there's just the database code, which your packages, your procedures, triggers, and so on that are part of that. And then the rules, your own, custom rules that are specific to your environment are really all part of the package then that the Datical engine will do its thing to apply those changes, vetting them out through the rules as it goes as the changes are promoted from one environment to the next. Other capabilities, which you're going to see mostly in the demonstration, but a couple of them worth calling out here are baselining. Baseline is something we do as we bootstrap into the managing your databases. And what we do in the baselining is we say, hey, point us to your best configured schema for a given application. And we use that as the original source of truth that from that we use to manage all the changes going forward from that point on. So that gives us kind of a golden image of where to start from and ensuring then that we can get all the other data schemas up to that level, and then that becomes how we make changes by applying that to that model. And then we've already talked about forecast, rules, deploy, rollback. A lot of things we do for rollback. There are several capabilities within rollback. First one is transactional. Like if we're rolling out several changes and something goes wrong, being able to unwind or not commit the changes. That's one version of rollback, transactional. The other version of rollback is really, I call it an undo, because you've actually applied the change successfully, but you want to undo that. And that falls into two categories, and that two categories are the ones, changes that Datical can automatically roll back just because it knows what's out there. For example, typically things around creates and adds, that type of thing, Datical can easily roll back that. The things where Datical needs a little help and where someone will need to provide how to roll it back are typically around destructive operations like drops and that type of thing. The good news is part of the way Datical does forecasting, we will let you know if, and using the rules, you can have rules set up that, if Datical can't automatically roll it back, someone needs to provide the rollback sequel, so you can have that part of your rules now, where if someone meets that condition, the change gets kicked back to them and they have to provide how to roll that change back and attach it to the package. And so that way that certain changes that can't be automatically rolled back will be given that sequel. And then of course from an auditing standpoint, kind of already talked about that, seeing just visibility into who's done what, when and where, even looking at past changes, pending changes, and even future changes through that. Multiple interfaces here. I'm going to demonstrate the user interface today just because it's easier to see what's going on. But we also have a comprehensive command line interface and lots of integrations out of the box, which integrate with a lot of the Agile tools that customers are using. The source control tools, pretty much we support any version of source control, Git, Perforce, Subversion, ClearCase, TVS, TFS, and so on. Build automation tools like your Jenkins, Hudson's, Bamboos, and even deployment automation tools such as IBM Urban Deploys, CA's release automation, Serena's deployment automation, Puppet, and Chef. So one thing that we realized is we need to be able to plug into these automated processes that are being developed to get applications and features out the door faster. So we have a lot of out-of-box integrations and also a very comprehensive command line for plugging in the tools where we might not have an automated or an integration out of the box yet. That's really it for the slide. So let me get into the demonstration. So this is the user interface, and quite a lot of things going on here. But to simplify it, here's that deployment plan that we talked about for my video rental schema. And here I go from a dev to test to integration, and all the way to production. This is view that most people won't see because I see dev to production. Depending on how you have your segregation of duties, like I may only see dev and test, for example, or only dev and dev integration, or only production, depending on how you set that up. For demonstration purposes, it's easier to have everything up here so I don't have to log in and log back out. So anyway, so in my world, the changes are originating in dev, they get deployed to test, integration, and then production at some point. We then have the states. The state green tells me every change that needs to be deployed has been deployed. And so we have the one, basically the one model which has a packages of all of the changes that need to be made to this, or that are in this database, all the objects. And so all these objects have been deployed. That's what green means. I can even drill down and look at each of these databases on an individual basis and see what may be different. For example, if I select this here, I'm able to see all the changes that were deployed. If there were any undeployed changes that are ready to go, I would see that. And if there's any future changes or changes that I don't want to go to this one database for some reason, they would be in the ignored column. So with that, let's go through and create a change and add it. Multiple ways to create a change. The first one I can just do through Datical. And so, let's say I want to do an add column to a table. And we can also pick up changes automatically from a database. For example, If you don't want to use Datical to make the change, what we can do is take a snapshot of the database, use your favorite tool to make changes, Toad, SQL Developer, SQL Server Studio, whatever you may be using there, or Irwin if you're using those tools. Make the changes, apply it to that database. We'll then compare the live database to the snapshot we took and automatically generate the changes packages for you. But here I'm going to create a change package from Datical itself, kind of give you an idea of what's going on here. So I'm going to add a column, and when I select add column, of course it knows I need to have tables, so I'm going to select the table that I want to add a column to. And maybe I'm just going to call it middle initial, then make it a varchar. And just because I'm in a goofy mood, I'm going to give everybody the middle initial of Z and set that as a default value. Hit next. I could add more changes if I wanted to, and at some point I'm going to say, okay, I'm ready. Let's finalize these. And here I'm just going to say I'm going to add a column. If I could type. And I'm the author here, and maybe I need to apply this to certain release. Let's say this is going to be part of the May release. So I'll select May, assign that a label, and that becomes intelligence that tells us how to manage that going forward. So I'm assigning it as a label and hit finish. Once I do that, we can go back to the model and see that here's that add column that I've added. And if I go back and hit status, we see now that we have changes that are undeployed. However, if I go to status to my other databases, it won't change. The reason I have that as doing that is I have policies set up that only changes that are labeled with a certain label can go forward. So I'm not ready to release this change to tests, so I don't have it labeled to go out yet. But I will let it go into development. And so, digging down again, let's see what's going on here. We have one or more undeployed changes, so I could select undeployed and see, yep, there's that change as we're doing add column. It's got the May, it's part of the May release. Hasn't been deployed because it's new. And so basically, we're ready to do something here. First step would be run a forecast. Forecast is going to let me know, is this going to work? And then it's going to process my custom rules as well to make sure it meets certain standards. And the way forecast works is it's taking a snapshot of the dev database, putting that model in memory, and running a simulation of applying changes. So it's not actually changing the live database, but it takes a snapshot of the live database in memory and then runs a simulation of that. Just the structure of the database, not the data. So here we have several problems. So phases of, logical checks are the first phase of forecast, which is looking at the functional stuff. Do things work? Can I add a column to that? Does a table exist to add that column in that target environment? And so if anything like that failed, you would see a phase of logical check failed. Well, everything looked good from a logical standpoint, but my custom rules caught some things. For example, from a business standpoint, I want all my change sets to be packaged with the JIRA ID. Whatever, if you're using Remedy or ServiceNow or whatever however your ClearQuest, whatever tools you're using to manage your change requests, you may want to, say that the ID has to be there as part of that database change. That way we can, link database changes to, application changes a lot easier. And by default, comments or dates are used for comments. However, I don't like that. I want you to have to write a comment. I don't want you to just take the default date. So I have a rule that catches that, which those are more business rules. And then I have a technical rule that says columns added to existing tables should not have default values set. And that's an error. So the result can determine what gets deployed and what doesn't get deployed. If they don't really give me a good comment, I'm not going to push back. They can still deploy. There's just going to be a warning in the record. However, when the result is an error, that means Datical will not deploy that change. So these two, at the minimum, have to be resolved before that change can be deployed. And so all this is done now without having the DBA team having to do reviews of the SQL and all that. The Datical's reviewing it for them automatically based on your personal parameters, how you want your changes deployed. a nice report's generated, which, of course you could, make part of a change record, circulate around. It tells you exactly, columns shouldn't have default values, and even shows you, tells you what's going on here, adding a column with a default value of Z. So I have to go fix this. So I just can't submit this, blindly let this change go, because Datical is not going to let me. So I'll switch over to design view, and this is kind of how you see how we manage and organize changes. So it's more of a structure versus raw SQL. So this is what the model, how we maintain that model. But here we have, of course, my author. Now, first thing I need to do is fix my ID. I'm going to have to add a JIRA number. I also look at my date, my comment, and it's a date. I need to change that. I then need to get rid of this default value because we don't support that. We don't want that to happen in our environment. So I'm just going to remove that. So without any DBA involvement, I've been corrected on the way we should do database changes, and I've had to go resolve all that, save it, and I need to run forecast again to see if it's going to work, unless something else is going to kick out. All right, so forecast worked this time, which means it got past our logical checks and our custom checks. So then what forecast does is look deeper now. Based on the change, it'll go to the next level and say, okay, now what are some more impacts of this change? And since that was working with a table or making a change to a table, we then go and look at, okay, tell me about the table. It has so many rows of data. In this operation, it tells me it's data safe because no values are being deleted or truncated, right? It's not a drop column. I'm not altering data types and shrinking fields, or if I change a floating point to to an integer, I would lose precision, which could lose data. So the nice thing is I know this works logically, it gets to my business rules, and we're not doing destructive things to data. And the nice thing about that is, when I now plug that into automation, my automation is going to look for those conditions. And so, so if this came up to be a 1+ or whatever, where this could be destructive to data, our automation would say, don't deploy. Now we need to have the DBA team review because we have an exception that we want to make sure we know why data could be possibly deleted here. So that ensures the safety of the database changes going through automation without having to, worry about data getting destroyed. And then just some, nice little view for, more, I call it eye candy, but yeah, it works. Tells you the table before, this is what it would look like afterwards, basically, adding another column. And then, for those who want to know, what's going on behind the covers, we actually convert that model, that package, to SQL based on the target database we're deploying to. So this would be the SQL that we would generate from that change that would be applied to that target database. So with all that, everything is good. I'm going to deploy. And the deploy report is going to look exactly the same as the forecast, except it says deploy, because everything worked. And we go back, and here our state is green. Everything's been fully deployed. At this point, whatever's going to happen, right? We're going to test our application. We're going to make sure that it's using the new, object in the database. Everything looks hunky-dory. At some point, we're going to be ready to release. When we're ready to release, the way I've defined the process is I'll go in and I'll select the changes that I want to deploy or to release. So I'll only have one change here that hasn't been released yet. And so what I'll do is add a label called deploy. And this is how I have mine set up. There's many ways to do this, but this just tells the way I've configured things that change now is now ready to be released. And so if I go back and look at my statuses will change now for the downstream environments, where here we show that it's still deployed in dev, but now it's available to be deployed in test. And so that's why those states have changed. And then from here, it becomes very simple. If everything should work, we're going to forecast a test. it should come back and say it should work unless something's different in my test environment that I wasn't expecting. But here we come back and say, yep, it's going to work. I'm going to deploy the change and test is ready to go. And so all the work basically, is done back where the database change is created. We vet it out, we run it through rules, we validate it, we test it. From that point on, it really should be forecasted. If nothing's different in the test database that we weren't expecting, it should work, and then we deploy here and it becomes kind of repetitive. So the goal is, right, shift all the work for the database changes to the left. And one of the things I should qualify, there's really two different types of database work. There's what we call system DBA, which is stuff around replication, sharding, performance, backup, patch, and stuff like that. That's not what Datical does. That's really is the DBA administrative task. What Datical focuses on are what are the objects in the database that, as part of applications being released more frequently, that you're going to want to enable more automated changes with. So we focus on those objects that's very customer driven, that say, hey, we want changes like, we want you to, we want sequences coming out of dev. We want all types of things being managed that. So, but certain operations like database links, jobs, stuff like that, that's really not what we focus on, because those things, you don't develop those in development and promote them as part of releasing an app. They're more administrative stuff. So kind of a little qualifier there, and where we kind of draw the line on what we do with the database. Everything we do about changing the database is focused on things that you'll want to do fast as your applications are quickly evolving and adding new features. So from that point, right, this becomes deploy to integration, forecast, deploy, forecast, deploy. And of course, all this gets plugged into automation. One of the things that typically customers do is they might have a view that only has dev here. So I'm going to forecast, I'm going to deploy, I'm going to test my app, and I'm ready to go. I would basically go to team and go to a check-in. I would check in my project to source control. That may trigger a build, which is now going to forecast those changes to continuous integration database, which nobody else has access to. That gives me another verification of the database changes before they come out of development. And then maybe the handoff from that build automation system to a deployment tool now to deploy to test, integration, or production. So many ways that Datical has been designed from the get-go to play well with others. So because we know people have different tools that they're looking at when they're wanting to bring agility to the application releases and want to include the database changes there. So we have it, make it very easy to plug into those existing processes and technologies.